Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Actual Magicians. Yes, I am an actual magician bookshelf, where I will today, in episode 3, be looking at The Great Beast, the life and magic of Aleister Crowley, as written by John Symonds in this particular case. This is my original book that I bought when I was about 17. It was published in this version in 1973, 75. So this version is falling to pieces. I read it to death on my way backwards and forwards to college, usually on the back of the bus going to and from college, and college breaks as well. This was my reading of choice. Now, although a lot of books have been written about Aleister Crowley since, I think this is the one that really generated a lot of interest in his life and work, because John Symonds paints a very extravagant picture of Crowley, his life and so forth, and is sort of critical as well, cynical as well, about some of the wilder claims that Crowley was prone to. And we can see that in an earlier version of the book, where it's very hyperbolic with the no deed was too hideous, no sin too evil for, dun dun dun, the wickedest man in the world. But it isn't really Crowley's debauchery, wickedness, sex magic, drug taking, and general rock and roll lifestyle that really inspired me. It was far more his travels, his poetry, and his magical work. That's the thing that I really wanted to emulate from Crowley when I was a young magician. So the next book I actually bought was the Holy Books of Thelema, again a sort of long-read book, and I think it was this that introduced me to the so-called Book of the Law, Liber El Vel Legis. This is the handwritten version of it, and then the typescript version of that as well. So this is the Book of the Law, and Crowley received this book through mystical trance in Egypt in 1904, and that's the thing that really made me want to go to Egypt. And sure enough, a year later, I left my first full-time job and took a rucksack and went to Egypt for about a month, and I stayed in Cairo. I travelled around, visited the pyramids, travelled across Sinai, did all sorts of epic adventures in sort of emulation, I guess, of Aleister Crowley. And it's something that happened in 1904 in Egypt that I'd like to come back to in particular. But first of all, if you're looking to read more about Crowley, then I recommend his own Magic Without Tears. In terms of a biography, I think Richard Kaczynski's Perdurabo is probably the best biography of Crowley. That's certainly one of the most comprehensive ones. But if you're reading Crowley himself, then Magic Without Tears is his letters later on in life to a student, explaining a lot of his ideas. Then his own massive Confessions of Aleister Crowley. This was edited by John Symonds and Kenneth Grant, and this is a huge book written by Crowley about his life and lifestyle, which is, I think it really gives you an insight to his sense of humour, his understanding of people, and his, I guess, manipulation of that understanding as well to live the life that he did. And then finally, the magnum opus, I guess one of them at least, Magic, or Magic in Theory and Practice. Again, this version edited by Symonds and Grant. And again, this is my original copy that has done a lot of work since. And there's a lot of theoretical and practical work in this for a good lifetime of magic. And in a future video series, I'll be looking at the practice of magic itself, both from a Thelemic point of view, as Crowley put it, chaos magic, witchcraft, spell crafting, and the forms of ceremonial magic as well. But returning to the Great Beast and the travels in Egypt, it's particularly the chapter in here that talks about Aeons, the holy guardian angel, that intrigued me. And here we have an account of Crowley discovering the stele of revealing, a funeral stele in Cairo, which his new wife, Rose Kelly, had seen in vision or told him to go and visit, and it turned out that this particular item was number 666. And I actually went to visit the stele when I went to Egypt, both first and second time, and it's not labelled that anymore because it'd been moved location for one thing. But it is quite, Crowley described it as rather unremarkable, but it does stand out, or certainly did when Crowley went to see it, because it's wooden, it isn't stone like a lot of them, and also it's very vibrant, it's really well painted, so it really does stand out anyway. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about that and mention it is because it is the genesis of Crowley's idea and concept about aeons and the ages of humanity and our species as a society and as civilizations. And it's something that I think is very important in Crowley that hasn't been written about a lot. Now, it's sort of like the age of Aquarius, like the zodiacal ages, but it isn't. It's similar but different. So the precession of the equinoxes, so-called, which is how the zodiacal signs work in terms of periods of time, which are about 2,220 years or something. So we have the age of Aquarius, and we have the age of Pisces before it, and so forth. Ironically, of course, the age of Pisces is the fish, which was a symbol of Christ. So therefore, there's the sign of freedom, like the 60s was the dawning of the age of Aquarius, as people would have it, and then the Piscean age belonged to Christianity. However, in Christian mysticism and various branches of Christian thought, there is a whole area called eschatology, which is sort of, in short, the study of the end times, however they may come, whether it's through the rapture, whether it's through the end of days, whether it's through the story of Revelations, whether it's through the return of Christ, and so forth and so forth. But this study is best formulated in this work by Joachim of Fiore. And this is, I've got two versions of this book by Marjorie Reeves. And you can see on the cover here, it's from a diagram in Joachim's work, which I'll see if I can find the actual photograph while I'm talking. There were a lot of tabulations of the sort of genesis of humanity, the tribes, the families, the ages, and so forth. This diagram here is of great importance. It shows the ages from the sort of time of Christ all the way into the near future, passing through different phases. And in this case, we have the sort of the phase of the church being prominent, and then the idea that the flock is returned to the shepherd in a sort of metaphor sense, in that we all become our own individual priests and so forth. And so there's a lot of writing about how the ages of humanity sort of move on. Now, sometimes this is quite rebellious writing, controversial, even heretical, in the sense of it, I guess, also postulates that the person writing it has some understanding of the way God works, the way the divine works, and the way humanity is destined. Now, this particular eschatology, this particular model of the world, came to Crowley in a very interesting way. First of all, he was very influenced by Eliphas Levi, and we'll be taking a look at some of the Eliphas Levi books in a later video. And Eliphas Levi had taken the eschatology with the idea of there being the age of the rose, the lily, and the nettle, not necessarily in that order. And I think Crowley, also from his own upbringing, his religious, deeply religious upbringing in the Plymouth Brethren, they also had a lot of ideas about the end of days and these great passages of time through which society and humanity were working. And I think Crowley was then inspired by a graphic, a drawing in the original Golden Dawn that he must have seen in one of the rituals, which was of the Last Judgment tarot card. Now, the Golden Dawn didn't have a Golden Dawn tarot deck. They had drawings of the cards and they were shown during rituals, but they didn't really have a Golden Dawn deck. Ironically, Golden Dawn members never used a Golden Dawn tarot deck. Aleister Crowley never used a Thoth tarot deck because it was published as a deck after he died. And Arthur Edward Waite and Pamela Coleman Smith likely never used a Waite Smith deck because neither of them were interested in using it in that way. And also, they both converted to Catholicism shortly after the deck was published. So there's an interesting quiz fact for you that Golden Dawn members didn't use a Golden Dawn deck, Aleister Crowley didn't use a Thoth deck, and Waite and Smith probably never used a Waite and Smith deck. But this diagram that he would have seen of the Last Judgment card had the picture, the image of the three figures rising up, but it had the letter Shin written on them, which was corresponding to the card, the Hebrew letter, but also, more importantly, in the original notes, it actually has Isis, the three ancient Egyptian gods and goddesses of Isis, Horus, and Osiris pictured on the card. And I think Crowley took that in the sense of seeing the Last Judgment, the end of days, as having a model with these three particular gods or goddesses, Isis, Osiris, and Horus. And then when he received the Book of the Law, it talks about the Aeon of Horus, the time of Horus, and Crowley being the great prophet of this future, of this present change. So Crowley developed this model as a result of all of these influences in terms of a sort of model like this, where instead of the ages of the church, instead of the rose, the nettle, and the lily, we actually have ancient Egyptian gods as labels for these great passages of time in human society. And in brief, Crowley saw the Aeon of Isis as being a so-called primitive age, matriarchal, tribal, shamanic, mother goddesses, and so forth, for 2,000 years. Then he saw the Aeon of Osiris, the patriarchal father god, the church, the idea of sacrifice, and sin and restriction as being the Aeon of Osiris, the father god. So we have the mother god, the father god, and then he saw himself as the rebellious prophet of the Aeon of Horus, which is like the sun god, both S-O-N and S-U-N. And Horus is more like a warlike god, a vengeful god, and Crowley equated this with the individual. So instead of having a very religious, state-bound, controlled society, we would enter a new society of the individual. And in the Book of the Law, he saw this as we see in the Holy Books of Thelema, we see this as being prophesied as being engendered by a time of war and warfare and conflict and so forth. And Crowley received that in 1904, before the First World War, which he lived through, and before the Second World War, which he also lived through. That's when the tarot deck was being produced by himself and Lady Freda Harris, which took a period of about 5 years, and the war was in the middle of that. So Crowley had this grand prophecy that was going to be prophesied and predicted by a time of warfare and conflict, and then almost immediately, within 5 years of that, we had the First World War, and then we had the Second World War. So Crowley sort of had some internal justification, at least, for the truth of his received writing and his model of the world. Be that as it may, this model then predicts 2,000 years of the age of Horus as being a time of self-individuation, self-empowerment, the self being prominent over the state, over the government, over religious systems and so forth. Every man and every woman being a star, as it puts it in the Book of the Law. And then after that, Crowley fell a little bit silent about, but there have been other people since that sort of predict the future Aeon being another 2,000 years after the age of Horus, as being like the age of Mart, the goddess Mart, so like a daughter goddess. So we go from mother, father, son and daughter through these great ages. Now, why is this important, and why do I think it's something to take out of the teachings of the great beast when there are already so many other things to do with magic and mysticism and states of consciousness altered through drug taking, meditation, yoga, magical practices, and all of the other wild and wonderful things that we can find within Crowley's life and magic? Well, it seems to me that the model of particularly the Aeon of Horus and the Aeon of Mart, and a lot of people have started to suggest that these Aeons overlap in the same way. If you think about it, when we're born, we go through our own Aeons. We go through the Aeon of the mother, when we're bonded to the mother, the father, when we start to become indoctrinated by the structure and society and patriarchal type models that might be around us. Then there's the Aeon of individuation, when we become teenagers and get interested in the life and magic of Aleister Crowley and other rebels in each of our individual cases. And then we become more perhaps socially aware in our older age, and this is something to do with the Aeon of Mart. So we go through these Aeons in our own life. But I think when we take a look at the Aeon of Horus as being the age of the individual for the next 2,000 years, but then somehow bridging back to the Aeon of Mart in the far future, transmitting itself back down in time to us, and there are some books just over here about Mart magic, which we'll look at in a separate video. It appears to me that there is a really useful way of applying this model to our lives and to making sense of our own individual life in the great scheme of things. There are a lot of other books that have postulated similar sorts of models, one of which is called The Fourth Turning. And that looks at the way generations, so not the individual lifespan or society's lifespan, but generations' lifespan, particularly in America in the case of The Fourth Turning, impact on the following generation, and how maybe two generations overlap one that then passes on and has to almost rebel against or repair or redeem the mistakes of the two preceding generations as it itself passes on those teachings to the next generation. So I think for me, the model of Aeons from Aleister Crowley gives us a far more comprehensive and connected model of how we as individuals work in society, and also how society in itself across all societies can be seen as a sort of meta principle that then we can examine and look at and work with and engage with in the way that we choose to do so. Because by understanding it and by seeing perhaps aspects where there's the Aeon of Horus being present, aspects where there's still an overlap from the Aeon of Osiris that we're trying to move away from and is somewhat obsolete, and aspects of the Aeon of Mart, which is a utopian or dystopian group collective, almost unimaginable future as at now, but perhaps AI powered and where we're all interconnected in some semi-digital way or otherwise. But there is a more group collective nature to the Aeon of Mart, and we can see both the positive side of that and the negative side of that even in today's society. And so as we look at conflicts in the world, as we look at political arguments, political stances, rather than seeing them as centrist, left, right, conservative, liberal, or however you want to frame it, there's a meta frame that we can also put around it as, is it to do with the Aeon of Horus or the Aeon of Mart, or is it a hangover from the Aeon of Osiris, or even is it a return, as is all of neo-paganism, to some extent the Aeon of Isis, so harking back to an imagined golden age. And we can see ourselves moving through these overlapping stages of our own development and the world. And this comes from Aleister Crowley, the nature of the Aeons, the prophecies and their nature being explained in the 3 separate sections or chapters of the Book of the Law in Crowley's work. So I'd like to leave us at that point for this particular video, episode 3 of The Actual Magician. Yes, I am an Actual Magician's bookshelf. And we're going to take a look in a lot more detail in separate series to do with Aleister Crowley, with the Aeons, with Mart, magic, and all of these things, and how we actually apply them to our lives and how we can make sense of our own life, make decisions based upon and engage with our life in a far deeper, magical, and even, dare I say, mystical and spiritual manner through some of these ideas and methods that are also contained within the field of Western Esotericism itself. So thank you for sharing my enthusiasm and delight for the great beast, the life and magic of Aleister Crowley. As I said, there are lots of other books written about Crowley, and I'll be mentioning those in the shorts that I'm doing for this series, and also in separate videos when we will take a deep dive into some of the aspects that I also discovered, I think, mainly through Crowley. For example, path working, dream work, sex magic, the Golden Dawn, tarot to some extent, although I was already reading tarot before I encountered Mr. Crowley, Thelema, Kabbalah, the whole gamut of things that Crowley took from the Golden Dawn originally and then developed in a wild, wild way outside of that original system. So thanks a lot for your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing you with a very different book in episode 4 of the Actual Magician's Bookshelf. Thank you.